The rain had already been falling for hours when I finally shut off the television and noticed just how quiet the house felt. It was the kind of rain that didn't come down in steady sheets but in uneven bursts, rattling the gutters and drumming against the old window panes like impatient fingers. The weather forecast had warned of a strong storm, but nothing about it seemed particularly unusual for the Midwest in spring. What made the night unsettling wasn't the storm itself, but the silence that filled the spaces between the thunder. I lived alone then, in a rented one-story house on the edge of town. The place was old, built sometime in the late 1940s, with creaky floorboards and a basement that always smelled faintly of mildew. I had moved in the previous autumn, right before the first snowfall, and while the house had its quirks, I had never felt unsafe there. But that night, with the rain hammering against the siding and the wind carrying occasional groans through the eaves, I couldn't shake a creeping tension. I remember checking the lock on the front door twice before heading into the kitchen to make some tea. The kettle hissed softly as I stood there, staring at the back door's glass window that looked out into the yard. The backyard was small, mostly patchy grass and a line of trees that marked where the property ended and a narrow strip of woods began. In the lightning flashes, I could see the wet branches bending in the wind. At one point, I thought I saw movement near the tree line, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed up by the darkness before I could focus on it. The power flickered once while I poured the hot water into a mug, making the lights dim and hum. My heart jumped at the thought of being plunged into total darkness. I reminded myself that storms did that sometimes, nothing unusual. Still, I moved quicker, grabbing the candle jar from the counter and a lighter from the drawer just in case. I carried the tea into the living room, curling up in the armchair by the window. From there, I could see the street outside, but it was deserted, just slick black asphalt reflecting the glow of the streetlight on the corner. A curtain of rain obscured most of the view, blurring the world beyond my little house until it seemed distant, unreal. For a while, I tried to calm down. I sipped my tea, scrolled through my phone, and told myself that nerves and weather didn't add up to danger. But every time the thunder paused, every time the rain softened for a moment, I felt as though I could hear something else. Small sounds inside the house, as if the storm outside was waking something in the walls. At first, it was faint, almost easy to dismiss. A soft creak in the hallway, a scuff against the floorboards. Houses made noise, especially old ones like mine. But then came what sounded like the slow drag of movement. Deliberate, too heavy for the wind, too distinct for my imagination. It came from the back of the house, near the spare bedroom I barely used. I froze in the chair, my tea cooling in my hands. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe the wind had pushed a branch against the siding. Maybe water had loosened something near the gutters. But deep down, I knew the sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside. I set my mug down as quietly as I could, my pulse thudding in my ears. I listened. For a long moment there was nothing but the steady hiss of rain. Then, so softly I almost missed it, there came another noise, something that could have been the whisper of fabric brushing against wood. I grabbed the flashlight from the side table. My phone battery was already low, down to 20%, and I didn't want to waste it. With the flashlight in one hand, I stood, my bare feet careful on the creaking floorboards. I made my way down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. The spare bedroom door was closed. That detail alone made me stop cold. I never kept that door closed. I used the room for storage mostly, boxes stacked along the wall, a folded air mattress, a couple of old coats hanging on the door. I had no reason to shut it, yet there it was, shut tight. I stood in the hallway, rain pounding against the roof, thunder rolling low in the distance, staring at that closed door. My mouth went dry. I thought of calling someone, anyone, but it was late, nearly midnight, and I knew what they'd say. "It's just the storm. You're overthinking." With a shaky breath, I reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing the dark room beyond. I swept the flashlight beam across it, my stomach twisting. Boxes, coats, the deflated air mattress. Nothing out of place. No one there. I was about to shut the door again when the light passed over the far corner, and I saw something that made my skin crawl. One of the boxes had been dragged forward several inches from the wall. The cardboard edges were wet as if touched by damp hands. I backed out of the room, pulling the door closed without taking my eyes off that box. My mind raced. Had I left it like that? Could moisture from the storm have warped it somehow, pulled it away from the wall? The excuses felt thin, fragile. I retreated to the living room, forcing myself to breathe slowly. I tried to convince myself I was safe, that there was no one else in the house. But then came another sound, this time unmistakable. A floorboard groaning in the hallway, too loud and too deliberate to be the house settling. I turned off the flashlight and sat in the dark, my heart hammering. The only light came in flashes from the storm, brief illuminations that carved the room into sharp angles before plunging it back into black. I strained to hear, every nerve in my body taut. Another step. Closer. Slow. I gripped the flashlight tight, ready to shine it down the hall, but something in me resisted. Some primal instinct told me not to reveal where I was. If someone was there, if someone had broken in, I didn't want them to know I was waiting. The sound stopped. The house went still. The rain continued, but it was like a wall between me and the world beyond. I sat frozen in that chair for what felt like forever, every second stretching into minutes. When I finally gathered the courage, I crept to the front door and checked the lock again. It was still secure. I checked the windows, latched. My mind kept circling the same terrifying possibility. Whoever was inside hadn't come in through a door or a window tonight. They had already been here. That realization sat in my chest like a stone. I thought of the basement then, the one place in the house I almost never went. The landlord had told me it was unfinished, just a utility space with a furnace and water heater. I had only been down there once when I moved in. The steps were narrow, the concrete floor uneven, the air damp and cold. I remembered thinking how easy it would be for someone to hide down there and never be noticed. And now, with the storm raging outside, with my nerves frayed raw, I couldn't stop picturing it. A figure crouched in the shadows of the basement, waiting. I wanted to leave the house, but the storm made that feel impossible. The roads would be slick, the visibility terrible. Besides, where would I go at this hour? I decided to turn on every light in the house. If someone was there, I wanted them to know I wasn't afraid, that I was aware. I moved room to room, flipping switches, the warm glow chasing away the darkness. By the time I returned to the living room, the house looked almost normal again, the fear fading just enough for me to breathe. That was when I noticed the back door. It was unlocked. I know I had checked it earlier. I know I had stood in the kitchen, staring out into the storm and made sure it was locked. Yet now the latch hung loose, the door shifting slightly with each gust of wind. My hands shook as I locked it again, sliding the bolt firmly into place. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass for a second, trying to steady myself. Outside, the rain fell harder, and for the briefest moment in the reflection of the glass, I thought I saw a shape behind me. Tall, indistinct, gone when I spun around. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair, the flashlight beside me, the storm raging until nearly dawn. Nothing else moved in the house, no more sounds came, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone. When the rain finally eased and the pale light of morning crept in, I forced myself to check the spare bedroom again. The box was still pulled forward, but now wet footprints trailed from the corner of the room to the hallway, faint but undeniable. They stopped at the door, and then nothing. I never figured out where they went. Story the end. The rain began in the early afternoon, a steady drizzle that gradually thickened into a relentless downpour. By the time evening came, it had become one of those rainstorms that seemed to make the world disappear. Streets vanished under slick reflections of streetlights, cars moved with a cautious, almost gliding rhythm, and the wind pushed the droplets hard enough against windows that the entire house seemed to shake. I had been looking forward to a quiet night alone, a rare luxury, and had settled into the living room with a blanket, a mug of coffee, and a half-read novel. The first hours passed in peaceful monotony, the kind of calm that comes with isolation when you are too absorbed in a story to notice much else. The rain hammered against the roof with a constant rhythm, but inside, the house smelled faintly of damp wood and the faint smoke of the candle I had lit. The power flickered once around 6 o'clock, and I had smiled, thinking it would pass quickly. But the flicker turned into a complete outage. The TV went black, the kitchen clock died, the soft hum of the refrigerator cut out, and suddenly the house was only lit by the dim, trembling candlelight. At first, it was comforting, the way the darkness seemed to hug the corners of the room and make everything feel smaller, safer. But as the storm deepened, the darkness felt heavier, more suffocating. Every creak of the old house sounded louder, every thump of rain seemed closer, and the shadows cast by the candles began to sway and stretch in ways that made me pause. Around 9, I first noticed the sound, a soft, deliberate tapping at the front window, faint, almost hesitant. My first thought was a branch, or perhaps a stray piece of debris caught in the wind, but the rhythm seemed too regular, too intentional. I froze, listening, heart hammering in my chest. The rain pounded around me, and for a moment, I considered calling out, but the idea of an intruder in the middle of a storm, hidden in the shadows, made my voice die in my throat. I got up slowly, creeping toward the window, gripping the handle of the kitchen knife for comfort more than defense. The curtains were drawn, and I could see only the rain-smeared glass. There was nothing outside but the darkness and the occasional flicker of lightning illuminating the soaked yard. I pressed my face to the glass, straining to see, but nothing moved, no figure, no shadow. Yet the tapping came again, soft but deliberate, and this time I could swear it had moved slightly, a change in angle that suggested someone or something was pacing just out of view. I bolted back to the couch and tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Storms do that to people. Heightened senses, create phantom sounds, shadows that seem alive. I kept the knife close, though, and tried to focus on my book. Every time the candle flickered, my heart skipped. Every creak of the house felt like footsteps approaching. By 11, the storm had worsened, the kind that rattles windows and makes the walls vibrate. I could hear the gutters groaning under the weight of the water, the wind tugging at the edges of the house. That's when I heard it, a slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. I froze mid-breath, listening. My apartment, or rather, my small 2-story house, was old. Floors creaked, walls groaned. But this wasn't the usual settling. This was the unmistakable sound of a heavy footstep, followed by another, deliberate, measured. I hadn't been upstairs in hours. The only way to get to that creaking was up the staircase leading to the 2 bedrooms. My stomach turned cold, but I told myself to calm down. Perhaps I had imagined it, or perhaps the storm had caused some structural shift, but deep down, I knew the sound had intention behind it. I tried to convince myself to ignore it, to stay in the living room, but the primal part of my brain refused. I had to know. Clutching the knife, I moved toward the stairs. Every step careful, slow, weighted. The creaking stopped abruptly as I reached the base. Silence. Too complete. My breath felt loud in my ears, each exhale a small bell in the stillness. I started up the stairs, flashlight in hand. The beam bounced off the walls, catching pictures and frames that seemed more sinister in the dim light. At the top, the landing was empty. I checked the doors to both bedrooms, then the bathroom. Nothing. Everything in its place. No signs of forced entry, no shadows hiding. And yet, the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of reach, did not fade. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it. Rain, storm, darkness, and isolation can do that to a person. But the unease wouldn't leave. I went back downstairs, trying to refocus and settled into the living room again, flashlight now on the floor, knife beside me. That's when I heard it again. Not upstairs, not outside. Inside. A faint, slow dragging sound like metal scraping lightly against the hardwood floor. It came from the kitchen. My heart stopped. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the house immediately, but I couldn't move. The dragging continued, careful, deliberate, not random, not the wind, not the house. Something was moving inside my home. I grabbed the flashlight and edged toward the kitchen, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the doorway, I froze. The back door, usually locked and latched, was slightly ajar. The rain blew in through the gap, cold and sharp. My knife felt suddenly inadequate. My throat went dry. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it. No one else had a key. I pushed the door gently with my shoulder. It creaked. There was no one there. Just the storm, the dripping water, and the open door swinging slightly in the wind. I slammed it shut and locked it again, checking it twice, triple checking. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe the wind had blown it open. Maybe I had forgotten. Then I heard a whisper. Not a shout, not a word. A breath, low and deliberate, coming from the direction of the kitchen table. I spun around, flashlight in hand, knife ready. Nothing. The shadows danced. The rain beat. The house groaned. Silence. I stayed in the living room for the next hour, heart thudding, flashlight beam trembling. Every small sound made me jump. Every flicker of candlelight a potential threat. At one point, I thought I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps in the hallway behind me. I didn't dare turn. My mind raced. I considered leaving, running out into the storm, but the thought of cold water and darkness outside was almost as terrifying as what might be inside. By 2 a.m, exhaustion began to win over terror. I kept the flashlight in my lap and tried to sit as still as possible, telling myself the storm was enough to make me hear things, that my mind was playing tricks. I must have dozed because the next thing I remember, I woke with a start, heart hammering. The candle had burned low, casting faint shadows, and the house was quiet again. I checked every door, every window, every lock. Everything was secure. Nothing moved. Nothing was out of place. And yet, the feeling remained, something unseen in the house, just beyond the edges of perception. I made coffee, tried to keep myself awake, but as the storm finally began to ease in the early morning hours, I felt the same creeping unease. I stayed awake until the sun finally broke through, pale and gray, flooding the rooms with light. Daylight never felt so relieving, yet even in the sun, I couldn't shake the memory of that whisper, the dragging, the faint touch of presence that had filled the house in the dark hours. I called a locksmith that morning to check every lock. Every window latch was reinforced. Nothing had been tampered with, and yet I knew what I had heard. I knew what had moved in my home, what had watched me from the shadows. For weeks afterward, I couldn't be alone in the house during storms. The sound of rain, the tapping of branches against the window, even a creaking floorboard sent a shiver down my spine. I slept with the doors locked and lights on, every shadow a potential threat. And late at night, when the rain fell, I swore I could hear it again. The faint dragging across the hardwood, the whispered breathing from nowhere, the reminder that sometimes the house isn't as empty as it seems. Story, the end. The rain started in the late afternoon, a slow drizzle at first, turning into a relentless downpour that rattled the roof and made the trees sway violently outside. The streetlights on her suburban street flickered intermittently, casting long, wavering shadows across the empty road. Claire had chosen to stay home alone that night, her parents out of town visiting relatives, and her older brother away at college. She'd thought it would be nice, a quiet night to herself, maybe a movie, some tea, and an early bedtime. But as the storm intensified, that comfort began to unravel into something else entirely. By 7 p.m, the house felt smaller, almost oppressive. The sound of water hammering the windows was deafening, yet somehow isolated. She kept the lights on, but every flicker of the bulbs reminded her of how quickly darkness could swallow her whole. The usual hum of the refrigerator and furnace, the subtle groan of the house settling, suddenly seemed unnaturally loud, like the storm had amplified every tiny sound to a level that made her heart pound. She tried to distract herself with a movie, but halfway through she noticed the lights flickering again, shorter and sharper this time. She paused the movie and stood up, peering out the window. Rain hammered the driveway, running off in miniature waterfalls. The storm had taken over every sense, and the house, normally cozy, felt alien. She shook her head, laughed at herself quietly, and returned to the couch, convincing herself she was being ridiculous. It wasn't until the wind shifted and the rain slashed against the windows at a sharper angle that she heard it. The faintest knock, tapping, coming from the side of the house. Tap, tap, tap. Her stomach sank. She froze, straining to hear over the storm. It wasn't consistent, not like a branch hitting the window in the wind. It was too deliberate, too measured. Tap, tap, tap. Claire's first thought was the window. The side window near the kitchen, the one that overlooked the narrow side yard. She tried to reason it away, telling herself the wind had blown a branch just right. But when she got closer, flashlight in hand, she saw nothing but sheets of rain, blurred shapes of trees swaying violently. Still, her heart raced, and she felt an icy prickle run down her spine. Back on the couch, she tried to focus on the movie again. She told herself she was imagining things, her mind racing in the quiet of the house, the storm outside feeding her imagination. But then came another sound, the soft scrape of something across the wood floor above her. She stopped breathing. The house only had her and the storm. Her parents were gone, her brother was gone, the neighbors were far enough away that they might as well have been gone, too. There shouldn't have been a sound upstairs. Not from anything living. She slowly got up and crept toward the stairs, her bare feet silent on the carpet. The scraping stopped as soon as she approached, replaced by the sudden, eerie silence of the storm's louder moments. She whispered to herself, trying to keep calm, telling herself maybe a loose shutter had shifted or some old water pipe was groaning, but something in the air told her that wasn't all it was. Claire's phone buzzed, a message from her friend checking if she was okay during the storm. She grabbed it, hands trembling, and typed back quickly, trying to steady her nerves. Yeah, just a lot of rain. You? No reply yet. She scrolled to check the time, 10:47 p.m. The storm had been relentless for hours now, and the lights had flickered multiple times, each flicker making her jump. She settled back on the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The sound of rain on the roof, once comforting, now felt like a drumbeat counting down to something. Every crack of thunder made her flinch. Every gust of wind against the siding sounded like footsteps pressing against the house. Around 11:15, the lights went out entirely. She gasped, the sudden darkness swallowing her in seconds. The storm outside was a wall of sound, the rain lashing against the house and the wind screaming through the trees. She fumbled for her flashlight, hands shaking as she turned it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating parts of the living room, but leaving edges that were almost pitch black. Every shadow seemed alive. She tried to call her friend, but there was no service. The storm had knocked out the cell tower nearby. She was completely alone. Her mind raced with every story she'd ever heard, every scary movie she'd seen, every tale whispered about intruders and home invasions during storms. She knew she was overthinking. She knew it. And yet the feeling in her gut screamed something wasn't right. Then she heard it. A knock at the back door. Sharp, deliberate. Tap, tap. She froze, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The sound came again, louder this time. It was impossible. She had locked the door, the sliding glass door at the back. She had checked again, and still there it was. Claire backed away from the door, heart racing, and picked up a kitchen knife, holding it out in front of her like a shield. She tried to call 911, but the line was dead. The storm had taken everything. Her eyes darted to the door again. Another tap, then silence. She held her breath. Her mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe a tree branch, maybe her imagination, maybe some trick of the storm. But the next sound shattered any rational explanation. The handle of the back door rattled. Slowly, deliberately. Someone was trying it. Claire's hands shook as she backed away, pressing herself against the opposite wall. She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but the storm drowned out any sound she might have made. The handle rattled again, then stopped. Silence. She counted in her head, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3, nothing. She dared not breathe. The next thing she heard was a soft scraping from the floor above. Not the storm, not the house settling. Something moving. Steps. Slow. Heavy. Conscious of weight, someone was upstairs. Claire's stomach turned to ice. She had been on the first floor the entire night. There was no one else in the house. No one should have been upstairs. She grabbed her flashlight and the knife, creeping toward the stairs. Her phone buzzed again, a notification from her security app. The camera at the back door showed nothing, just darkness and rain. But then the app refreshed. And there it was, a pale face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide, staring directly at the camera. The mouth was open, but no sound could be heard over the storm. Claire screamed, dropping the phone and knife. She ran to the living room toward the front door. Then she stopped, realizing she had to go through the hallway. And that's when she saw it, muddy footprints on the carpet, starting from the kitchen, leading toward the stairs. They were wet, sloppy, and fresh. She ran to the front door, tried to open it, but it was stuck. Panic overwhelmed her. She could hear footsteps upstairs now, moving faster, heavy, deliberate, circling. The storm outside was deafening, but she could hear the creak of the steps clearly. Someone was in her house. She ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and held the knife in front of her. Her breath came in short gasps. She tried 911 again. Still dead. The storm had taken every connection to the outside world. She felt trapped, hunted, completely alone. Minutes passed. She could hear soft tapping on the bathroom door. Tap, tap, tap. A voice whispered something she couldn't make out. The handle rattled gently. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear. Her mind raced with every possible scenario. Every story she had ever heard about home intrusions flashed before her eyes. Then the bathroom door creaked open slightly. A shadow moved in the slit between door and frame. Claire froze, unable to scream, unable to move. The shadow paused, then disappeared. The storm outside masked any other sound. She stayed against the wall, trying to think, trying to breathe, until the first hint of light appeared outside the window. Dawn was breaking. Claire crept out of the bathroom. The house was silent. No footsteps. No rattling doors, no shadows. She checked the back door, which was still locked. The footprints were gone. The muddy trail vanished as if it had never existed. Her security camera showed only the storm, no face, no figure, nothing. Her parents returned that afternoon. She told them everything, but they suggested it was stress and the storm playing tricks on her. Her friends insisted it was a dream, or perhaps her imagination after watching too many horror movies. But Claire knew what she had heard, what she had seen. She knew the footsteps, the handle rattling, the shadow at the door. Weeks later, she found scratches on the back door frame, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had tried to force it open from the outside. She had no explanation. No one had entered, no one had been caught, and there was no sign of anyone in the neighborhood who could have been involved. Sometimes, on rainy nights, she could still hear the faint tap of fingernails on the window in her dreams. It was always the same. Deliberate, measured, waiting. She would wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of the storm alive in her mind, and the unmistakable certainty that she had never been truly alone that night. Story the end. The rain came down in relentless sheets that night, hammering against the roof and windows of my small apartment, like the universe was determined to make the world uninhabitable. I had just moved into this place a month ago, a cramped studio on the outskirts of a small town in Ohio. The town was quiet most of the year, but when it rained like this, the streets became empty rivers, reflecting the occasional glow of a flickering street lamp. I liked rainy nights usually. They felt cozy, a good excuse to stay inside, drink coffee, read a book, and let the storm create its own soundtrack. But tonight felt different. There was an odd weight to it. A sense of being watched that made me sit straighter on the couch, wrapping my blanket tighter around me. I had spent the afternoon unpacking boxes and putting the small apartment in order. By the time the sky darkened and the rain began, I was tired. I made myself a cup of tea, boiled water, and settled on the couch with my laptop. I scrolled through social media, half listening to the storm outside until my eyes grew heavy. Eventually, I dozed off, the sound of the rain lulling me into an uneasy sleep. When I woke, it was around 10 o'clock. The storm had intensified, and the wind rattled the windows in ways that made my heart jump every time. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the digital clock on the counter. It read 10:12 p.m. A flash of lightning lit the room for a second, followed by a sharp crack of thunder that seemed to shake the entire building. My first instinct was to pull the blanket over my head, but then I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was coming from the front door. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was the wind or rain striking the door in some odd way. But then it came again, a soft, deliberate knock. Once, then silence. My heart started to pound. Nobody should be outside at this hour, not in this kind of storm. I convinced myself to stay calm. Maybe someone had gotten caught in the rain and needed help. I wasn't normally afraid of strangers. I got up slowly, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and walked toward the door. I peered through the peephole. Nothing. Just the dark, wet street and the occasional flicker of a street lamp reflecting off puddles. My breath caught in my throat as a gust of wind rattled the front window. I swallowed hard, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my ears. I turned back to the living room and tried to focus on the TV, which I had left on a low volume. Late night infomercials flashed across the screen, their overly cheerful voices grating against the tension in my chest. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe I had imagined the knock. Then I heard it again, louder this time. 3 distinct raps on the door, slow and measured, like someone was testing me, watching to see how I would react. I jumped, my pulse racing. My phone was on the counter. I grabbed it, debating whether I should call 911. My rational brain screamed that I should, but a small part of me hesitated, afraid that making the call would confirm that something was truly wrong. I went to the window this time, peeking through the blinds. The storm had turned the street into a silver blur. I could barely make out the outlines of cars or buildings. Nothing moved. Nothing that was human. I backed away from the window and tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was probably some prank or an animal, although the knocking didn't fit. My mind raced. Maybe it was someone who had been following me. Maybe it wasn't random at all. I returned to the couch, trying to settle down. My tea had gone cold, and the warmth of the blanket didn't help. I kept glancing at the front door, expecting to see a shadow moving outside. Minutes passed, and I started to think I might have imagined the entire thing. Then I heard it from the back door. It was the same slow, deliberate knock. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The back of my apartment faced a small alley, and the door was old and creaky. Whoever was outside had to be soaked from the rain. I debated calling the police again, but didn't want to do it yet, hoping that whoever it was might leave. The knock came again, followed by a faint rattling of the doorknob. I swallowed hard, realizing that someone was definitely trying to get in. I slowly backed away, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911. My voice trembled as I explained what was happening. The dispatcher asked questions, kept me on the line, telling me to stay calm and stay inside. I crouched behind the couch, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the storm outside and the faint, ominous sounds of movement. The knocks didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more insistent, as though whoever was outside had grown impatient. I could hear the slight squeak of wet shoes on the porch, the brushing of hands against the doorframe. The wind howled, masking the sound somewhat, but I could tell the intruder was testing every point of entry. The front and back doors, the windows, I hadn't yet locked. I sat frozen, unable to move, my mind cycling through every horror story I'd ever heard. I imagined the worst. I imagined them breaking in and standing over me, drenched, silent, watching. The thought made my stomach churn. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The only noise was the rain and the wind. I stayed crouched behind the couch, barely breathing, waiting for any sign that it had resumed. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. The dispatcher reassured me that officers were on the way and would be there soon. When the flashing red and blue lights finally appeared outside my windows, I practically ran to open the door. 2 officers arrived, drenched from the rain, flashlights in hand. I explained everything: the knocks, the footsteps, the doorknob rattling. They went around the building, checking doors, windows, and the alley. They found nothing. No footprints in the wet concrete. No sign that anyone had been near the apartment. One officer suggested it could have been a prankster, a teenager trying to scare someone. The other said maybe a loose piece of siding or a branch had caused the noises. They promised to patrol the area for the rest of the night and told me to call if anything else happened. I locked the doors again, triple-checked the windows, and sat on the couch, too tense to move. I kept the lights on and the TV muted, listening to the rain. Hours passed. Every gust of wind, every creak of the apartment made me jump. I eventually drifted off into a fitful sleep, curled up on the couch with my phone clutched in my hand. Morning came, and the storm had passed. The streets glistened in the sunlight, puddles reflecting the early morning sky. I tried to convince myself it had all been in my head, that the storm and my isolation had made me paranoid. But when I went to the back door, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Bare footprints were imprinted in the wet mud on the patio. They led straight up to the door, but there were no footprints leading away. I called the police again, my hands shaking. They came back, examined the prints, and said it was hard to tell much since the rain had partially washed them away. But it was clear that someone had been there, standing at my door. For weeks afterward, I stayed hyper-aware. Every sound, every shadow made me jump. I couldn't sleep without a light on. I kept the doors locked, the windows latched, and double-checked everything before bed. Friends told me I was overreacting, that storms can make houses seem alive with noises, that maybe it had been an animal. But I knew what I had heard. I knew the knocks, the doorknob rattling, the deliberate footsteps. Months later, I moved out of that apartment. I didn't tell anyone exactly why. I just said I wanted a place closer to work. But the memory of that night stayed with me. Every rainy night, every gust of wind, I could still hear the tapping on the door, feel the presence outside that I had never seen but knew had been real. Even now, years later, I hesitate before opening my door when it rains heavily. I can't explain it. I don't know who or what it was that night, but I know I wasn't imagining it. And sometimes when the storm is particularly fierce, I swear I can hear those three soft raps, still testing, still waiting. Story, the end. The rain started early that evening, long before the sun had set. I had just gotten off work and was driving down Route 47, a stretch of two-lane highway that cut through the outskirts of Pennsylvania, toward the small town where I lived. The kind of town where streetlights were few and far between, and when it rained, the roads glistened like black glass, reflecting the sparse glow of the lights above. The drops pelted my windshield with a relentless intensity, and even with the wipers on full speed, visibility was poor. I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, mentally noting every curve and pothole in the road. I had spent the day alone in a hospital archive, filing old patient charts. It was the kind of job that didn't leave you with much energy, but I liked the quiet. My coworkers had all gone home hours ago, and the halls smelled faintly of disinfectant and mildew. Driving home, I was eager to settle into my small apartment, light some candles, and let the sound of the storm lull me into sleep. By the time I reached the turnoff to my neighborhood, the rain had intensified, falling in sheets that obscured even the headlights of oncoming cars. I slowed to a crawl, the tires splashing water into the roadside ditches. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the road, just before the curve. At first, I thought it was a deer, common in these parts, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, drenched and motionless. My stomach tightened. It was late, dark, and no one should have been out there in that weather. I slowed even more, unsure whether to stop or just drive past. The figure raised an arm slightly, not waving, but pointing toward the road ahead. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but part of me hesitated. Something about the way the figure stood, too still, too deliberate, made my skin crawl. I glanced into my rearview mirror, checking for cars behind me. There were none. I decided to slow down even further and honk softly. The figure didn't move, just stood there, pointing. I shook my head, muttering to myself, and tried to drive past, but the car in front of me braked suddenly. My heart jumped. There was no car, nothing in front, just the rain and the black asphalt. I slammed on my brakes, skidding slightly, and my headlights caught the figure again. It wasn't pointing at the road, it was pointing at me. I gasped and instinctively threw the car into reverse, spinning the wheel, trying to get around it. But then it moved. Not like a person walking, more like sliding, its wet clothes clinging to its frame. It moved fast, unnaturally fast, across the road, straight toward the side where I had no escape. My hands trembled on the wheel. I could feel my heart pounding against my chest like it wanted to break free. I finally managed to maneuver the car around it, tires skidding in the rain, and drove past at full speed. I didn't look back. My pulse was erratic and my thoughts raced. Whoever, or whatever, was standing there had disappeared when I glanced in the rearview mirror, leaving only the sound of the storm and the occasional distant crash of thunder. By the time I reached my apartment, I was shaking. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and leaned against it, trying to convince myself I had imagined the figure. Maybe it was a trick of the rain and shadows, a deer's outline distorted by headlights, or perhaps just exhaustion making my mind play games. I told myself that repeatedly as I moved into the living room, dripping wet, still listening to the storm hammering against the windows. I lit a few candles, their warm glow barely pushing back the darkness that had settled over the room. I sank into the couch, trying to relax, but every creak of the building, every groan of the walls in the wind set my nerves on edge. My apartment wasn't large, just a one-bedroom unit in an old brick building, but the layout meant I could see the front door from the couch. Every shadow cast by the flickering candles looked like movement. Around 10, I decided to make some tea to calm myself. The kitchen was cold and damp from the storm, and I could hear the wind raking through the alley behind the building. I wrapped a towel around my shoulders and filled the kettle, shaking slightly. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping at the window. Not the kitchen window, my back window, which faced a narrow alley and the side of the building next door. I froze, listening. The tapping came again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I told myself it was probably just a branch whipping against the glass, but the pattern, the timing, didn't feel right. I swallowed hard and walked cautiously to the window, peering out into the darkness. The alley was empty. The wind tugged at the trash cans and overgrown weeds, making strange shapes in the shadows, but there was no one there. I stepped back, my pulse racing. Maybe I really was imagining things. The storm could play tricks on your eyes and ears. I tried to distract myself, pouring the boiling water into a mug and adding tea. I sat back on the couch, sipping slowly, trying to calm my shaking hands. But then it came again. A faint scraping sound, like nails dragged along the brick outside. It moved from one side of the alley to the other, deliberate and slow. I couldn't ignore it this time. I got up, grabbing the bat I kept by the couch, and crept toward the window. The rain had reduced to a heavy drizzle, making the alley glisten in the faint candlelight. I strained my eyes but saw nothing, not even a shadow. I backed away, trying to rationalize it. Maybe someone was breaking in next door, or a raccoon had climbed the fence. My thoughts were scattered, each more implausible than the last. I sat down again, clutching the bat, listening to the storm, trying to tell myself I was being paranoid. It was close to midnight when I finally decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights, leaving only the faint glow of the street lamp outside, and crawled into bed. The storm was still heavy, but the rhythmic sound of rain had a kind of hypnotic effect. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. I must have drifted off because I woke suddenly to a different sound. A low, almost imperceptible creak from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart leapt. I told myself it was probably the building settling, but the sound repeated, slower this time, like someone stepping carefully on the old wooden floor. I stayed frozen, listening. The creak came again, then paused. I couldn't move. My mind raced, imagining a stranger in my apartment waiting for the right moment to attack. The rational part of me knew the doors were locked, windows closed, but the fear in the other part, the part that tells you bad things happen even when you think you're safe, took over completely. Then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost under the sound of the rain coming from the far end of the hallway. Not words I could understand, just a hiss of air that sounded like speech. I bolted upright, heart hammering, eyes wide. Hello? My voice was barely more than a squeak. No answer. Just the whisper, faint now, almost teasing. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, creeping to the doorway. The hall was empty. I shone the light along the floor and walls. Nothing. Not a shadow, not a figure. Just the dull, damp carpet and the peeling paint. I backed away, breathing hard. I couldn't stay there. I needed to leave, but I had no car keys in the bedroom, and the front door was several rooms away. I considered calling 911, but what would I even tell them? Someone is whispering in my house? They'd think I was crazy. I decided to wait, to let my heart rate slow. I sat on the bed, clutching the bat, listening. Hours passed, the storm outside gradually easing, but the tension didn't lift. Every creak, every sigh of the old building made me jump. I was awake until morning, too scared to sleep, eyes darting toward the hallway every few seconds. When the sun finally rose, it was gray and misty, the storm reduced to light drizzle. I got up, exhausted, and made my way to the front door, expecting to see signs of forced entry. There was nothing. No footprints in the wet mud, no marks on the door, nothing. The street outside was quiet, almost eerily so. I tried to tell myself it was all my imagination, that the combination of isolation, storm, and fatigue had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had heard, what I had felt. Something had been there. Something had moved through my apartment that night, unseen, leaving no trace but the memory of its presence. Even now, whenever it rains heavily and I'm alone, I remember that night. The tapping at the windows, the scraping along the walls, the whisper in the hallway. It's impossible to forget once you've felt that kind of fear. the kind that makes every shadow, every sound feel like a threat. I moved out of that apartment not long after. I never found out what had happened, and no one else reported anything unusual that night. But every time the rain hits a window and the wind picks up just right, I feel that same tight knot in my chest. The memory of eyes watching me from the darkness, waiting. And I know, deep down, that whatever it was there's that night, it's still out there somewhere in the storms and the dark, waiting for someone else. Story the end. The rain started early in the evening, soft at first, just a steady drizzle that made the streets glisten under the orange glow of the streetlights. By the time it darkened to night, the drizzle had turned into a downpour, relentless and heavy, hammering against the roof, the windows, and the little patio outside. I had spent the day running errands, but by 6 o'clock I was back home, tired, tarrying wet, carrying groceries, and trying to avoid the puddles forming on the driveway. The neighborhood was silent except for the rain, the occasional distant rumble of thunder, and the soft splash of tires through standing water. I lived alone in a modest 2-story house on the edge of town. It wasn't a big place, nothing fancy, just enough for me to feel comfortable. The previous owners had left behind creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a basement that always smelled faintly of mildew. Most nights I didn't mind the house's quirks, but storms like this always made it feel alive in a way that was unsettling. I put away the groceries, made myself some dinner, and tried to ignore the storm outside. I turned on the TV, but the sound of the rain overpowered it, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and move with the flashes of lightning that occasionally lit up the windows. I told myself it was just the storm making me anxious, that there was nothing to worry about. I was alone, yes, but I was safe. Around 8 o'clock, as I was pouring a glass of water in the kitchen, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but it was there. A soft, deliberate knock on the front door. My stomach tightened. I froze, listening. The rain was loud, but the knock had a rhythm to it. 3 slow taps, distinct and deliberate. I told myself it had to be the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the siding. But as I held my breath, waiting for another knock, the silence of the house made the sound impossible to ignore. I walked cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. Nothing. The porch light cast a dim circle on the wet concrete, but no figure stood there. No car in the driveway, no shadows moving in the rain. I stepped outside, the cold rain hitting my face, and looked around. The yard was empty, the trees swaying under the storm, and the street beyond was deserted. I shut the door firmly behind me, convincing myself it was nothing, and went back inside. But the feeling didn't leave me. It settled in my chest, a tight knot of unease. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind through the eaves made me flinch. I tried to focus on the TV, on the movie I had been watching, but my mind kept returning to the front door, to the possibility that someone or something was out there. About half an hour later, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a second, then came back on, making me jump despite myself. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer by the couch, feeling more nervous than I wanted to admit. It was an old flashlight, heavy and reliable, but my hand shook as I held it. Then I heard it again. 3 knocks, this time from the back door. I froze. The back door led to a small porch and yard, bordered by a line of trees that rustled ominously in the storm. I didn't open it. I didn't even approach it. I just stood there, listening. The knocking came again, slower this time, deliberate and patient, like someone testing me. I backed away, my pulse racing. My rational mind told me it was impossible, that no one could be standing out there in this storm, but my instincts screamed at me to check anyway. I moved quietly to the kitchen, peering through the small window in the door. The rain distorted everything beyond the glass, and I could see only darkness, nothing human, nothing alive. I locked the door, turned on all the lights I could find, and tried to calm myself, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me. Every sound was amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant roar of thunder, the constant pounding of rain against the roof. I drifted in and out of consciousness, finally dozing off around midnight. I woke to a silence that felt too complete. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the storm had left an oppressive quiet in its wake. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. They were soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just listened as the steps moved slowly toward the living room, then paused. The silence was worse than the noise, the anticipation worse than fear. I reached for my phone, my hands trembling, and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator that someone was in my house, describing the footsteps and the strange feeling that had settled over me. She told me to stay on the line, to stay quiet, and that officers were on their way. The footsteps didn't come back. I stayed in bed, clutching the phone, listening to every creak and groan of the house. When the police arrived, they conducted a thorough search. Every room, every closet, even the basement. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no one. Just me, alone in the storm-drenched house. The officers suggested it was likely my imagination, the storm playing tricks on my mind, but I knew what I had heard. I knew the knocks, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Even now, I can't explain it. Weeks later, the same thing happened again, during another storm. 3 knocks at the door, footsteps in the hallway. The basement door left slightly ajar when I was sure I had locked it. I moved a few months afterward, leaving the house behind, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. The way the storm amplified the ordinary, turning shadows into threats, sounds into signals. The way the quiet made me certain I wasn't alone, even when I was. I've never stayed alone during a storm since. Even in my new apartment, the first heavy rain of the season makes me check the locks twice, listen to every creak, and wonder if what I thought I left behind really ever left at all. Because I know now that sometimes the ordinary becomes something else entirely, and the worst part is that you can never be certain when it's happening. Even now, when it rains and the wind hammers against my window, I swear I hear it. 3 slow knocks, soft but deliberate, echoing in a way that makes my blood run cold. And every time I remember the basement door, the footsteps, the way the house seemed to breathe around me, alive with something that was never meant to be seen. Story the end. The rain started early that evening, a soft, steady drizzle that soon turned into sheets of water pelting the streets and rooftops. I had driven home from work in the pouring rain, gripping the steering wheel tight and cursing every time a car splashed water across my windshield. By the time I got home, soaked through and chilled to the bone, the streetlights were glowing dimly through the gray haze of rain, and the wind had begun to whip in, rattling the windows. My apartment was on the 2nd floor of a small, older building in a quiet suburban area, the kind where neighbors keep to themselves and streets are dark and empty at night. I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, shaking off the wet jacket and boots, leaving a puddle on the linoleum floor. The apartment smelled faintly of mildew, a mustiness that had always been there, but tonight it seemed sharper, somehow more suffocating. I flicked on the living room light and went to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee. The storm outside sounded relentless now, rain hammering against the windows, wind rattling the sliding glass door that led to the small balcony. The rhythmic sound should have been comforting, the kind of white noise that lulls people into calmness, but instead it left me uneasy, almost hyper-aware of every creak, every groan, every subtle movement. I sat on the couch with my coffee, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the storm. The apartment was otherwise silent. I tried to focus on a show on TV, something mindless to distract me, but I kept catching myself staring at the windows, expecting, or maybe fearing, to see something move in the sheets of rain. After a while, I noticed a faint tapping sound, almost rhythmic, coming from somewhere behind me. My first thought was that it was the wind against the old siding of the building, but as I listened closer, it sounded deliberate. 3 taps, then a pause, then 3 taps again. I froze, my heart hammering. The apartment had thin walls and old floors that creaked with every step, but this wasn't a floorboard creaking. It sounded like someone tapping on the window. I stared at the glass that led to the balcony. The blinds were drawn, but the rain wasn't heavy enough to completely mask movement outside. I couldn't see anything. The tapping didn't come again, but the silence after it was deafening. I told myself it was the storm, some branch or debris hitting the glass, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. The rhythm of the taps had been too precise, too intentional. My stomach turned as I considered the possibility that someone was outside. My apartment was on the second floor, which made that seem unlikely, but not impossible. I went to the kitchen to grab a knife, something to defend myself with. Though I felt ridiculous holding it, the rain still thrumming against the window, my apartment otherwise empty. I crept back to the living room and approached the sliding glass door. I peeked through a gap in the blinds, squinting through the rain, but there was nothing. The balcony was empty. No figure crouched there, no shadow lurking in the storm. I let out a shaky breath and tried to calm myself, telling myself I was imagining things, that the storm was playing tricks on my mind. I sat back on the couch and sipped my coffee, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to distract myself with the TV again, but the tapping sound returned, this time from the front door. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. I nearly dropped the knife. My hands were trembling. I hadn't expected anyone to be at the front door. I live alone, and it was a rainy night in a quiet neighborhood. Who would come here? But the sound was unmistakable, deliberate, close enough that it could only have come from outside the door. I crept to the peephole, pressing my eye to it and straining to see through the dim hallway light and the shadows cast by the storm. Nothing. Just the dark hallway, empty and silent. I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone was tapping on my door during a storm and I couldn't see them? I didn't want to look foolish, so I didn't call. I backed away, trying to calm myself. I told myself to just wait it out. Whoever it was, they'd leave, or it was nothing at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I kept glancing around the apartment, imagining shadows shifting in the corners, shapes forming in the darkness. Then I heard something new, a soft creak from the bedroom. My bedroom was at the far end of the apartment, and the door was closed. I hadn't gone in there all evening. My heart raced as I approached slowly, every step deliberate, gripping the knife in my hand. I stopped just outside the door and listened. There it was again, a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight on the floor. I swung the door open and flicked on the light. The room was empty. Clothes were strewn across the floor as usual, but no one was there. The window was closed, the balcony door locked. I stood frozen for a moment, my breathing loud in the quiet room, and then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, low, almost drowned out by the rain. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. The whisper came again, barely audible, from somewhere near the closet. I froze, staring at the slightly ajar door. My body screamed to run, to leave, but I couldn't move. I gripped the knife tighter and slowly approached the closet, every step echoing in the small apartment. The whisper stopped. The closet was dark. I stepped closer, and suddenly something cold brushed against my arm. I screamed and swung the knife, hitting nothing but air. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, and the whisper came again, this time clear and right behind me. "I see you." I spun around, knife raised, but no one was there. The room was empty, the shadows thick. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I backed out of the bedroom and slammed the door, leaning against it, gasping for air. The rain outside seemed to have grown louder, more aggressive, like it was trying to drown out everything else. I didn't know what to do. I considered running, leaving the apartment in the middle of the storm, but where would I go? The streets were deserted, wet and slippery. The thought of stepping outside into that darkness was terrifying. I decided to wait, to stay put, and hope it was all a trick of my mind. Then the tapping started again, this time all around the apartment. Front door, windows, sliding glass door, even the walls. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, over and over, a rhythm that I couldn't ignore. My nerves were shredded, my body trembling uncontrollably. I felt trapped, like the storm outside had been replaced by some unseen presence inside the apartment with me. I tried to call someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. I hadn't charged it in days, and in my panic I hadn't thought about it. I felt completely alone, completely helpless with this, whatever it was, moving through the apartment. I remembered the emergency exit stairs at the back of the building. If I could make it there, maybe I could get to the ground and run down the street to a gas station or somewhere with lights and people. I grabbed my jacket, the knife, and slowly crept toward the back door. The tapping followed me, moving closer, faster, relentless. I reached the back door, yanking it open and stepping onto the stairs. The rain hit me immediately, cold and drenching. I took a step down and froze. Across the alley, on the second floor balcony of the neighboring apartment, a figure was standing. Tall, still, just watching me. I couldn't make out a face, just the dark outline of a body, soaking wet, silent. I turned and ran, slipping on the metal stairs, the knife clattering to the ground. My heart raced, adrenaline pumping through my veins as I scrambled down, one step after another. I hit the sidewalk and didn't stop, sprinting down the street, rain blinding me, until I reached a 24-hour convenience store. I burst through the doors, soaked and shivering, and collapsed against the counter. The clerk, a young guy with a hoodie, looked at me like I was insane. I tried to explain, but I couldn't. The words tumbled out, broken and frantic. He didn't understand, just stared. I didn't care. I stayed there for hours, soaked, shivering, watching the street. The rain continued unrelenting, but the figure never appeared again. The next day I went back with the police. They checked the apartment, the stairs, the neighboring balconies. Nothing. No footprints, no signs of entry, no figure. Everything was exactly as it should have been. And yet I knew what I had seen. I had felt it, that presence, that tapping, that whisper. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't imagination. It was real. I never spent another night in that apartment. I moved across town, somewhere on the ground floor, with more people around and fewer shadows. But even now, when it rains hard and the wind rattles the windows, I can't shake the memory of that night, the tapping, the whisper, the figure watching me from the darkness. And I know, somehow, it's still out there, waiting. Story, the end. The rain started around mid-afternoon, just a light drizzle that made the sidewalks glisten and the leaves of the trees droop under the weight of the water. By evening, it had turned into a steady downpour, pounding the roof of my small apartment and creating little rivers down the street. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend alone. My roommate had gone out of town for work, and I'd finally have the place to myself. Usually, that would have been a relief, but there was something about the storm that made me feel uneasy, even before the first drops of night hit the windows. I had moved into this old building in the suburbs of Chicago a few months ago. It was nothing fancy, just an old brick apartment with creaky floors, peeling paint in some corners, and a hallway that always smelled faintly of damp carpet. The kind of place that was fine during the day, but took on a different character at night, especially during storms. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread as I made a cup of tea and turned on the TV, figuring that the noise would distract me from the storm and my imagination. I had been watching an old horror movie, ironically, and I could hear the rain hitting the windows in rhythm with the ominous soundtrack. Every so often, the power would flicker, making me jump and glance nervously at the ceiling. I told myself it was just an old building, old wiring, nothing more. I wasn't afraid. Well, not yet. Around 8 o'clock, I was in the kitchen pouring myself a glass of water when I heard it. A knock at the front door. I froze, holding the glass halfway to my mouth. The knock was slow, deliberate, and just loud enough to make me jump. I convinced myself it was someone checking the apartments or maybe a neighbor needing help, but it was odd that no one had rung the doorbell. I went to the peephole and looked out. The hallway was empty, lit by dim fluorescent lights, the kind that flicker every so often. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing. No one. Just the hallway and the sound of the storm outside. I closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. I told myself it was just nerves, the storm, my imagination. But as I turned back to the living room, I felt that familiar pit in my stomach, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat back down, trying to distract myself with the movie, but the knock came again. This time it was 3 slow taps, rhythmic, deliberate. My heart raced. I stayed still, listening. It came again after a pause, 3 more taps. I grabbed the phone and dialed my roommate, but he didn't answer. I left a message, my voice shaky, telling him about the knocks, asking if he had someone checking the apartment while he was gone. No response. I sat there, the tea growing cold, the sound of the storm loud in my ears. I didn't hear anything for a while, so I tried to convince myself it was over, that the storm had just caused something to hit the door in a way that sounded like knocking. But then I heard it again, this time from the back door that led to the small balcony. I froze, staring at it. The rain outside was heavy. the wind lashing against the glass, and I could barely see beyond the balcony. But I could hear it clearly. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. My hands were shaking as I picked up the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer. I moved quietly, trying not to make a sound, and peeked through the glass. Nothing. No one. Just the rain and the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind. I locked that door too, double-checked the windows, and went back to the living room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I needed to focus on something else. I turned on every light in the apartment, tried to watch the movie again, but every flash of lightning made me flinch. Every rumble of thunder sounded like footsteps approaching. Around 10 o'clock, I decided I should try to sleep. I didn't want to, but staying up all night was worse. I double-checked the locks again, pulled the curtains tight, and got into bed. I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself I was safe, that no one could be in the building without me noticing. But I couldn't sleep. The storm was relentless, and every noise in the building, the creak of the pipes, the hum of the radiator, the occasional thud from an apartment above, felt amplified. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving in the hallway outside my door. At first, I convinced myself it was just the building settling, but then it came again. A soft, deliberate shuffle, like someone's shoes dragging along the carpet. My stomach dropped. I held my breath, listening, every muscle in my body tense. The sound moved closer, and I realized it was stopping right outside my door. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. My phone was on the nightstand, and I clutched it tightly, debating whether to call 911. I could hear the faint drip of water from the balcony above, the wind rattling the windows, but beneath it all, there was a presence. Suddenly, the shuffling moved away down the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed perfectly still, listening until I was sure the intruder, or whatever it was, had gone. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke a few hours later to silence. The storm had calmed to a light drizzle, the rain no longer hammering against the windows. I got up to check the apartment, moving cautiously, and found nothing unusual. The doors were still locked, the windows secure, and no signs of anyone having entered. But something felt off. The apartment felt colder than it should have, and the shadows in the corners seemed to linger longer than they had before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But every time I heard a knock or a creak, I flinched. Every storm since then has brought me back to that night, the feeling of someone outside my door, waiting, patient, deliberate. A few weeks later, I moved to a new apartment, hoping to leave that night behind. The new place was safer, smaller, more secure. But I still check the locks during storms, still listen for the knocks, still feel that sense of unease when the wind rattles the windows. I know now that storms have a way of making the ordinary terrifying, and I've learned that sometimes, even when you're alone, you're never really alone. Even now, when the rain falls heavily, I can't help but glance at the door, listening for the slow, deliberate knocks that haunt my memory. And I know that if I ever hear them again, I won't hesitate to lock every door, hide, and pray that whatever is outside doesn't follow me inside. Story the end. The rain had started early in the afternoon, a steady drizzle that made the streets shimmer and the air smell of wet asphalt. By evening, the drizzle had turned into a persistent downpour, the kind that hammered against the windows and made the world outside seem distant, distorted, and untouchable. I lived alone in a modest suburban house in Ohio, a 2-story place my parents had sold me after college. It wasn't fancy. Wood floors that creaked when you stepped on them the wrong way, drafty windows that whistled when the wind came, and a basement that smelled faintly of mildew. But it was home. Most of the time, I liked it. But on nights like this, when the rain drowned everything else out, it felt different, like it had a presence of its own. I had spent the day running errands and getting ready for the weekend. My roommate, who usually filled the house with his chatter, music, and occasional TV shows blaring from the living room, was out of town visiting family. That left the house completely empty, except for me, and normally that wouldn't have been an issue. In fact, I had been looking forward to the solitude, the quiet that would allow me to catch up on work, read, or just relax. But as the storm began to intensify, I realized how uneasy I felt about being alone. I made myself a simple dinner, poured a glass of wine, and settled onto the couch with a blanket. The sound of the rain was loud against the windows, and the occasional roll of thunder made the walls vibrate slightly. Every few minutes, lightning flashed so brightly that it illuminated the living room like daylight. Um, I tried to focus on a movie, but it wasn't long before I realized I wasn't really watching it. My attention kept drifting to the windows, the blinds slightly shaking in the wind, the way shadows moved across the room. It was around 8:30 when I first heard it. A soft tap, 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 tap against the front door. I froze, holding my glass halfway to my lips. The sound wasn't heavy, like someone banging, but deliberate, controlled, 3 slow knocks. My first thought was that it must be the wind, or maybe a branch hitting the door. I told myself it had to be nothing, but my stomach was tight, my heart thudding in my chest. I walked cautiously to the door, trying to keep my breathing steady. I looked through the peephole, but the porch was empty, the rain falling in sheets that blurred my view. No car in the driveway, no shadow, no person. Just the wet concrete glistening under the dim porch light. I opened the door slightly and stepped out. The wind and rain hit me immediately, cold and relentless. I scanned the yard and the street. Empty. I even walked down to the edge of the driveway. Nothing. Whoever, or whatever, made that sound had vanished. Back inside, I tried to shake it off. Maybe it really was the wind, or my imagination. I locked the door and returned to the living room, trying to distract myself with the movie again. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, flinching at every creak of the house, every thump of the rain against the roof. About half an hour later, the power flickered. The lights dimmed for a second and the TV went black, then returned. I muttered under my breath, grabbed the flashlight from the drawer near the couch, and went to check the breaker. As I did, I heard it again. 3 slow knocks, this time from the back door, the one that led to the small wooden deck in the backyard. I froze. The rain was pouring so heavily that anyone standing outside would be soaked instantly. I strained to listen. The knocks came again. Tap, 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 measured, intentional. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone, my first instinct being to call someone. I considered dialing 911, but I hesitated, telling myself that the storm, the old house, and my nerves were playing tricks on me. I tiptoed toward the kitchen and peered through the small window of the back door. All I could see was darkness, distorted by sheets of rain and the occasional flash of lightning. No one. Just the shadows of the trees swaying in the wind, as the wet boards of the deck reflecting the pale light. I locked that door too, checked all the windows, and turned on every light in the house. Every shadow seemed to deepen with the illumination, but at least the light gave me a small sense of control. The storm intensified. By 10 o'clock, the wind had picked up, the rain beating against the roof like a drum. I made myself some tea, trying to focus on something mundane, but the fear had settled deep in my chest. Every sound, the hum of the fridge, the occasional thud from the attic, the creak of the floorboards, made me flinch. I kept imagining shadows moving just beyond my sight, fleeting glimpses at the corner of my eye. Eventually, exhaustion overpowered my fear, and I decided I should try to sleep. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, pulled the curtains tight, and climbed into bed. The room was warm, the covers comforting, but sleep did not come easily. I lay there, listening to the storm, the rain hitting the roof, the wind rattling the windows, my mind replaying every strange sound I had heard earlier. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving down the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart froze. I told myself it was impossible, that the house was empty, that the storm had to be playing tricks on me. But the footsteps were real. They moved slowly, methodically, as if someone knew exactly where they were going. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, clutching the phone on my nightstand. I wanted to call 911, but I couldn't move. The footsteps stayed there for what felt like minutes. Then, just as quietly as they had arrived, they moved away, down the hall and toward the living room. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in bed, flashlight in hand, listening to every creak, every drip up of water from the ceiling, every distant noise. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the eaves and the occasional distant car driving down the street. When I finally mustered the courage to check the apartment, everything was exactly as I had left it. Doors locked, windows secure, nothing disturbed, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners darker, and the memory of those slow, deliberate knocks haunted me. I spent the next few days trying to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was a neighbor, a prank, or just my imagination amplified by the storm. But I knew what I had heard, and I knew what I had felt. The house, so familiar during the day, had become something else entirely at night, alive with a presence that I could neither explain nor ignore. Weeks later, a similar storm rolled through. I was in my new apartment by then, a safer, smaller place with better locks and no drafty windows. But when the rain hit the roof that night, the sound brought back every memory of that first storm. The knocking, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. Even though I knew I was alone, I checked every lock twice, listened for every sound, and sat up all night with the lights on, afraid of the shadows. I have learned, through that night and others, that storms have a way of making the ordinary terrifying. They amplify every sound, every shadow, every creak until it feels as if the house itself is alive. And I have learned that sometimes, even when you are alone, you are never truly alone. Now, whenever the rain falls heavily against my window, I listen. I check the locks, I check the windows, and I hold my breath at every creak and knock. Because deep down, I know that what happened that night could happen again. The house, the storm, the presence, it doesn't care that I have moved, that I am safer now. It only waits, patient, deliberate, ready to remind me that solitude can be a dangerous thing. Even after all these years, when I hear the rain hammering against the roof and the wind rattling the blinds, I can't help but glance at the doors. I can't shake the memory of the slow, deliberate knocks, the methodical footsteps, the way the house seemed to breathe around me. And I know, with a certainty I cannot explain, that sometimes, no matter where I am, someone or something is still out there, waiting. Story the end. It was one of those nights where the rain seemed to have a personality of its own. The kind of rain that doesn't just fall, but hammers, rattles, and pounds on every surface it touches, as if it's trying to get in. I had just moved into a small rental house on the outskirts of a town in rural Pennsylvania and vacant for months, and I got it at a bargain price. It wasn't much, just a two-bedroom, single-story home with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and the faint smell of mildew that clung to the carpet and walls. I was used to small-town isolation, having grown up in a similar environment, but this place felt different, off somehow. I brushed it off as the usual first-night jitters and unpacked my things. By the time I finished, the sun had set and the rain had intensified. I lit a few candles because the power kept flickering, and the hum of the storm outside made the house feel simultaneously cozy and oppressive. I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by cardboard boxes, sipping a cup of tea and trying to convince myself that the unease I felt was irrational. I had lived alone before. I knew what loneliness felt like. This was just rain, wind, and creaky old wood. Nothing more. Then I heard it. A knock. Soft, deliberate, but not the kind you'd expect from a visitor. This was the kind of knock that didn't belong. It came from the front door, muffled by the rain, but precise, slow, deliberate. I froze. Who would come knocking in this weather at this time of night? My phone was in the bedroom charging, and I hadn't bothered to grab it. I told myself it was probably a branch or debris hitting the porch in the wind. The rational part of my mind fought back the growing knot of fear in my stomach. Another knock. Slightly louder this time. I slowly approached the door, peering through the peephole. The porch was empty. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the torrential rain, but there was nothing. No one. My heart was racing. I considered calling someone, anyone, but the thought of fumbling for my phone and leaving the safety of the living room made my stomach churn. I stepped back and tried to focus on the sound of the rain. It was easier to pretend the knock hadn't happened, if only for a moment. Then I heard it again, this time from the back door. My house had two exits, both of which led to the backyard, which was mostly trees and thick undergrowth. The sound was the same, slow and deliberate, unmistakable. I tiptoed toward the kitchen, peeking through the small window by the door. My breath caught in my throat. The backyard was empty, shrouded in darkness, but there was something there. A shadow? It was impossible to tell, a figure that seemed to dissolve into the rain. I stepped back, my pulse pounding, and the sound of the knock came again, but now it was inside the house. I froze, staring at the living room door. My mind raced. I live alone. I locked the doors when I got home. There was no one here. And yet the knocking was coming from inside, a slow, methodical thumping that echoed through the walls. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer, more for comfort than defense, and edged toward the sound. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The knocking stopped the moment I reached the living room. Silence, heavy and suffocating, settled over the house. My ears strained for anything, but only the rain remained, hammering on the roof. Then I heard it again, but this time from upstairs. I froze. My house only had one floor. One floor. There was no upstairs. My legs felt like lead, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the knife. The sound wasn't just knocking this time. It was dragging, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was moving something heavy across the ceiling. My rational mind fought to explain it. Maybe the storm had loosened something in the attic, maybe an animal. But the sound was too deliberate, too measured. This wasn't random, it was intentional. I backed away toward the hallway, planning to check the rooms in case someone had broken in, but my eyes caught movement out of the corner of my vision. The living room window, covered by rain-streaked curtains, was rippling like someone was pressing against the glass. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the window, yanking the curtain aside. Nothing. Just the rain, dark shapes of trees swaying violently in the wind. But then I saw it. Footprints in the mud, leading up to the porch, stopping abruptly as if whoever had come had vanished into thin air. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, the knife clutched in my hands, when I noticed something else. On the floor near the window, inside the house, there were wet footprints. They led from the front door, across the living room, and stopped just short of the hallway. They were small, like a child's, but I didn't know any children. I lived alone. The footprints disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. I ran to the phone in the bedroom, fumbling to dial 911. As I did, I heard it, breathing. Soft, shallow, but right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the dim shadows of my furniture and the flickering candlelight. I told the dispatcher my situation, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. "Someone's in my house," I whispered. "Please, I need help." The operator asked me to stay on the line, to lock myself in a room if possible. I grabbed my keys, knife, and phone and retreated to the bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. I could hear the rain outside, the wind, and, most unmistakably, the slow, dragging footsteps from the living room, circling, almost taunting. I pressed myself against the wall, trying not to breathe too loudly, listening to every creak, every whisper of movement. Minutes felt like hours. I could hear the front door shudder under some invisible force, like it was being pushed, then the sound of water dripping inside the house. I called out, voice trembling, "Who's there?" Silence. Then in a voice that was almost a whisper, barely audible over the storm, I heard, "Why are you here?" My blood ran cold. It wasn't a question from someone outside. It came from inside, right behind the bedroom door. I slammed my ear against the door. Nothing. Just the sound of my own panicked breathing and the storm outside. The dispatcher asked if I was okay. I told them I was trapped, the footsteps never stopping. They assured me police were on the way, but the wait was unbearable. Every second stretched, a slow, torturous eternity. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Dead silence, punctuated only by the relentless rain. I considered opening the door, calling for whoever or whatever it was, but fear rooted me to the floor. I hugged the knife, willing myself not to move, when I saw it. On the wall opposite the bed, etched into the peeling wallpaper in wet, dripping streaks, was a word, "Leave." My eyes widened, heart leaping into my throat. The writing wasn't there before. It was fresh, as if drawn by hands unseen, and the wetness suggested it had been written in rainwater, condensation, or something else altogether. I pressed myself into the corner, shaking, whispering to myself that this had to be a dream, a hallucination. But the smell hit me next, wet, metallic, like blood, faint but unmistakable. The police arrived minutes later, though it felt like hours. By the time they forced open the front door, the house was empty. No footprints, no intruder, No sign that anyone had been there. The wet word on the wall had vanished, the rain somehow having erased it. They scoured the house, inside and out, even checking the woods behind the property. Nothing. I tried to explain, my voice breaking, that I had seen footprints, had heard dragging footsteps, had felt someone breathing behind me. They wrote it off as stress, the storm, maybe a break-in that had been thwarted by my own vigilance. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen, and I knew deep down that what had been in that house with me hadn't been human. I stayed there one more night, unable to sleep. The storm finally subsided in the early hours, leaving only a mist that clung to the trees and dampened everything in sight. I packed what I could carry and left, leaving behind the house, the neighborhood, and any sense of reason I had clung to. I haven't returned since, and I never will. The thought of being alone at night in that house, listening to the slow, deliberate knock or feeling the cold brush of something unseen against my skin, still makes my blood run cold. I've moved multiple times since, but every heavy rain reminds me of that night. Every drop against a window or the scrape of wind against siding makes my stomach twist. I know that whatever it was, it didn't want to be seen. It only wanted me to know it was there. A few weeks later, I checked online for the history of the house. Apparently, a man had died there under mysterious circumstances about a year before I moved in. The details were scarce, but neighbors mentioned hearing odd noises, knocks at the door, and footsteps that didn't belong to anyone. Some people swore they had seen shadows moving in the windows late at night. Others spoke of feeling watched, a presence in the house that was impossible to explain. No one had ever lived there long. The realtor hadn't mentioned any of this when I rented the place. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they didn't want me to know. I sometimes wonder if it was him, the previous occupant, trapped between worlds, waiting for someone else to feel the same fear he had felt in his final moments. Or maybe it was something else entirely, something older that had claimed the house for itself. I try not to think about it, but on rainy nights when the wind howls and the streets are empty, I can still hear the knock. Slow, deliberate, almost polite, like it's asking permission to come in. And I always feel that cold brush of air against my neck, the faint whisper in my ear, asking me the same question I asked that night. Why are you here? Some nights I lay awake thinking I'm safe, that I'm far enough away from that house. But then I see a shadow move across my bedroom wall, fleeting and silent. My dog, usually calm, growls at nothing, hackles raised. My windows, double locked, rattle in their frames, and deep in my chest, I feel the same terror I felt that night, the creeping, patient, intelligent fear of being watched by something that knows every weakness, every corner where I hide. It's like the storm followed me, like the presence didn't care about distance. I've tried to tell friends, but they dismiss it. Old house, stress, bad nerves, they say. But I know better. I know what I felt, what I heard. That night wasn't just a fluke of the mind. There was something in that house, and it didn't leave. It just waited for the next person foolish enough to be alone at night during a storm. And I've learned the hard way that no matter how far you run, some things aren't bound by walls or distance or reason. Some things wait, some things watch, and some things follow. Story the end. It had been raining all day. The kind of relentless, drumming rain that made the streets look like they were covered in oil, reflecting the streetlights in long, wavering lines. I had stayed home, planning to spend the evening alone with a cup of coffee and a stack of old horrors. The power had flickered once in the afternoon, leaving me in a shadowy stillness, but otherwise it had held steady. I lived in a small house on the outskirts of a mid-sized town in Oregon, far enough from the main roads that traffic noises were minimal, but close enough that I didn't feel completely isolated. Or at least I hadn't until that night. I remember sitting on my couch around 8 in the evening, the rain pounding against the windows like tiny fists, when I first heard the softest creak from the hallway. My house was old, built in the 50s, so the floors groaned all the time, especially in heavy rain. I ignored it, telling myself it was probably the settling of the house or the pipes shifting. I curled deeper into my blanket and opened the first book I had picked out, a collection of short stories by a local author. An hour later, I felt it again, more insistent this time, a slow, dragging sound from the hallway. I froze, trying to convince myself it was my imagination. The house was quiet except for the rain, but now there was a rhythm, almost like something heavy moving slowly across the wooden floor. My heart started to beat a little faster. I told myself it was the wind shifting the windows or maybe a branch scraping against the side of the house. Still, the sound persisted, intermittent and deliberate. I got up and walked toward the hallway, trying to sound casual. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer, only the tapping of rain and the faint groan of the old floorboards. I checked the doors, even the ones that led to the basement and the attic. Everything was locked, just as it should have been. Shrugging, I went back to the living room, telling myself I was overreacting. I tried to read, but every few minutes I would hear it again, creaking, dragging, soft, but deliberate. Eventually, I decided to check the back door. The rain was coming down harder now, splattering against the glass panes. I peered outside, shining my flashlight into the dark, empty backyard. Nothing moved, no shadows shifted in the corners. I exhaled sharply, feeling a little silly for being so on edge. It was just the house. That's all it could be. Around 10 o'clock, I heard it again, this time from the living room itself. I froze, listening carefully. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway or the back door. It was coming from behind the couch. My pulse jumped. Slowly, I edged toward the sound, my hands trembling slightly. When I peeked behind the couch, there was nothing. Just the rain streaking down the windows, the empty space behind the couch, and the dim light of the lamp. I sat back down, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. That's when I heard it, unmistakably this time. A whisper. A breathy, almost inaudible sound that seemed to say, "I'm here." I froze, my coffee cup rattling in my hand. "Hello?" I whispered, barely audibly. No response. I told myself it was just the wind or the rain, but my stomach had dropped. There was a weight in the air, like someone had just stepped into the room behind me, unseen. I tried to ignore it and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I filled it, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow crossing the living room, darker than the darkness already present. I spun around, heart hammering, and there was nothing. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly spilled the water. By midnight, the storm was at its peak. I decided to lock myself in my bedroom until morning. I carried my phone and a small flashlight, double-checking the locks. I pulled the blanket tight around my shoulders and tried to sleep, but the house was alive with sound. Soft footsteps, distant whispers, and the constant creak of wood under some invisible weight kept me on edge. Every few minutes, I thought I saw a shadow move past the door, only to disappear when I looked directly at it. At 1:15 a.m., my phone buzzed with a notification. I frowned and picked it up. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why are you hiding?" My hands went cold. I hadn't given out my number to anyone I didn't know. My first instinct was to call 911, but the storm had knocked out cell service. The text had come through my carrier, but there was no way I could reach anyone. I tried to convince myself it was some glitch, a prank, but the hair on my arms was standing up. Another text arrived almost immediately. "You can't hide from me." I bolted upright, shining my flashlight toward the bedroom door. Nothing. The only sound was the rain and the occasional groan of the house. I tried to call my neighbors, anyone, but the signal was dead. Panic started to set in. I realized I had left the doors unlocked earlier that day when I went to check the mail. The thought made me shiver uncontrollably. I decided I had to leave the bedroom. I grabbed a kitchen knife for protection and moved slowly, flashlight in hand. The house felt wrong, alive in a way I had never felt before. Shadows stretched and twisted as the light moved, and I could swear I heard someone breathing behind me. I moved from room to room, checking the locks and windows, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the living room, just beyond the light. It was tall, thin, and impossibly still, like a shadow carved out of the darkness itself. I froze, unable to breathe. The figure didn't move, but I felt it watching me, studying me. Suddenly, it moved. A step, slow and deliberate, closer toward me. I screamed and swung the knife, but my arm passed through nothing. The figure was gone, but the pressure remained, like the room itself was pressing against me. I ran to the front door, yanking it open, and the wind and rain hit me like a wall. Outside, the storm was relentless, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no shadows, nothing. I wanted to run to get to a neighbor's house, but my legs felt like lead. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door and locking it again. By 2:30 a.m., I was in the living room, huddled in the corner with the knife in my lap. The house had gone quiet again, almost too quiet. I felt a presence, though, heavy and pressing. I wasn't alone, and I knew it. At 3 a.m., the whispers returned, this time coming from all around me. Why are you here? You shouldn't be here. I'm right behind you. My head was spinning, my vision blurry. I could feel the air move, like something was brushing past me, circling me. I screamed again, but the storm swallowed the sound. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Hours felt like minutes. Eventually, the rain lightened, the storm moving on. I cautiously stood, looking around the living room. Everything was back to normal, or at least it looked normal. I checked the doors and windows again, all locked, all secure. I never saw the figure again, and I never received another text. But the next morning, I found something on my kitchen counter. A single wet footprint, size I couldn't determine, just above the floorboards. The pattern wasn't human, at least not entirely, and it ended abruptly near the wall. I moved out a few days later. I told myself it was stress, imagination, maybe some kind of electrical issue with my phone, but the memory of that night still makes my skin crawl. Even now, when it rains hard, I can't sleep with the lights off. I keep my doors locked, my phone close, and I never stay alone in the house past sundown. Sometimes when the storm hits just right, I can still hear it. Soft footsteps, distant whispers, and the faintest drag of something moving in the dark. I tell myself it's far away, that it can't reach me now. But I know better. I learned that night that some things don't need to be seen to terrify you. They just exist in the spaces between the sound of rain, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of wind through a cracked window. And once they know you're alone, they never truly leave. Story the end. The rain had started in the late afternoon, a steady, unrelenting drizzle that soaked the streets and made the sidewalks slick and reflective under the dim glow of streetlights. I had just gotten off work at a local convenience store on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with fluorescent lighting that buzzes softly and the faint scent of coffee and cleaning chemicals lingering in the air. Normally, I would have called my roommate to pick me up, but he was out of town visiting his family, so I was left to face the storm alone. Driving through the empty streets, I could feel the tires hydroplaning slightly with each puddle I passed. I had taken this route many times before, through the older neighborhoods that seemed almost frozen in the 1970s, with their narrow roads and wooden houses that leaned slightly as if bowing to the weather. Rain pattered against the windshield with an almost hypnotic rhythm, and the sound was oddly comforting, masking the sense of isolation I felt being the only car on the road. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the storm had escalated. The wind pushed against my car like an invisible hand, and branches scraped the roof with a wet, hollow sound. I grabbed my bag and rushed inside, shutting the door behind me with a firm click that seemed unusually loud in the otherwise empty house. I live alone. Well, alone except for the occasional raccoon that had found its way into the backyard, or the stray cat that had adopted the house for a few days. I liked the solitude, most of the time, but nights like this had a way of making me question that preference. I set my bag on the counter and made myself a cup of tea, the kettle whistling insistently over the ambient noise of the storm. As I sipped, I tried to focus on mundane things, checking emails, scrolling through social media, but the wind outside seemed to pick up, rattling the windows with sudden sharp gusts that made my nerves tighten. The shadows cast by the dim light of the kitchen flickered across the walls in a way that was almost alive. About an hour in, I heard it, a faint tapping from the back door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, branches or something. But then it came again, more deliberate, like someone lightly knocking with their knuckles. My stomach dropped, and I set my mug down, straining to hear over the storm. The tapping came in quick bursts now, a rhythm that didn't match the wind or the rain. I walked cautiously to the door, peeking through the small window. Nothing. Just the wet backyard, slick grass, and the swaying trees. I laughed nervously to myself, telling myself it was probably a branch hitting the glass. But as I stepped back, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. There was a shadow near the fence. I froze, heart hammering, convinced I was imagining things. But then it moved again, slow and deliberate, staying just out of reach of the porch light. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and shone it toward the shadow, my hands trembling. There was nothing there. Just the rain, pouring down like a waterfall in the night. I convinced myself to ignore it, telling myself that stress, fatigue, and the storm were making me paranoid. But the unease had settled deep in my chest, a heavy weight that refused to leave. I tried to distract myself by turning on the television, but the storm seemed louder now, and every flash of lightning made the room feel smaller, the shadows longer. I could hear the tapping again, this time from the window beside the living room. My breath caught in my throat. It was too steady, too intentional to be a branch. I couldn't see anyone through the rain-streaked glass, but the sound was close enough to make my skin crawl. I decided to call the police, though I felt foolish. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. I explained the situation, keeping my voice as calm as possible. The dispatcher assured me that they would send a unit, but it would take some time because of the weather. I hung up, feeling a mix of relief and terror, and tried to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible, sitting on the couch with the lights off, hoping the storm would drown out any noise. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from the stairs. My house is a single story, but the attic stairs fold down from the ceiling in the hallway. I had not opened them in months. The sound made my blood run cold. Footsteps? But no, these weren't footsteps. They were heavier, deliberate, like someone was pressing down on each step with intention. I didn't move, barely breathing, listening to the sound approach the living room. My eyes darted to the corner where the shadow of the stairs fell. I could make out nothing at first, just the faint outline of the attic stairs moving as if being pulled down. And then from the darkness, a voice, low, barely audible, but unmistakably human, whispered, "I'm here." I bolted toward the front door, fumbling with the lock. The wind howled as if mocking my panic. My hands were slick from the rain I had tracked in, and it took longer than it should have to open the door. Behind me, I could hear the stairs snap back into place, and the floorboards creak as if someone had landed heavily on them. I didn't stop to look. I ran into the storm, soaked to the bone, adrenaline propelling me toward the neighbor's house 3 doors down. They were home, thank God. I pounded on the door, drenched, shivering, trying to catch my breath. The neighbor, an older man named Tom, opened the door slowly, his face pale as he took in my state. I tried to explain, but words failed me. He let me in, wrapped me in a blanket, and called the police again. When the police arrived, they searched the house thoroughly. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the wet backyard beyond my porch, nothing in the attic. The doors were locked from the inside, the windows secure. The officers looked at me like I had imagined it, and I hated that they didn't seem to grasp the fear I had felt, the sound of footsteps, the whisper, the presence that had been so undeniably real to me. The rest of the night was spent at Tom's house, watching the storm through the window, too afraid to go back to my own home. Every flash of lightning made me flinch. Every clap of thunder felt like it was right outside my door. I stayed there until morning, when the rain finally eased into a drizzle. When I returned home, I found nothing out of place. My furniture was where I had left it, the floors dry except for the puddles I had tracked in, and the attic stairs folded neatly into the ceiling. But something had changed. I felt like the house was different, like it was waiting, breathing with a presence that didn't belong to me. That night marked the beginning of weeks I will never forget. Every rainy night afterward, I would hear faint tapping at the windows or doors, shadows flitting at the edge of my vision. Sometimes it would be a whisper, sometimes a creak from the attic. I would wake in the middle of the night to find objects moved slightly, chairs angled differently, or the faintest footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the attic stairs to the living room. I tried everything, security cameras, new locks, motion sensors, but nothing could stop it. The presence didn't need to break in. It was already there, slipping in the spaces between my senses, inhabiting the dark corners of the house where light and reason couldn't reach. I spoke to friends, tried to rationalize it as stress, but no one could understand the weight of a whisper in the dark that says your name when you are alone. One night, I decided to confront it. I went to the attic, flashlight in hand, heart pounding, calling out into the darkness. I know you're here. I see you. The rain outside hammered against the roof, masking the sudden silence inside. And then I heard it, not a whisper, not a footstep, but a voice. Close, so close I could feel the air move as it spoke. You don't see me, but I see you. I ran from the attic, down the stairs, out into the storm. My neighbors tried to calm me, but I couldn't stay. I stayed in my car all night, rain pelting down, gripping the wheel, too afraid to go inside. Morning came, pale and gray, but the presence lingered, a weight pressing on my chest. I eventually moved out, unable to live with the house any longer, leaving behind all my belongings. Friends helped me pack in the daylight, carrying boxes into a truck as the storm clouds gathered again. I told them it was just stress, just the fear of being alone in a big house. I never told them about the whispers or the shadow on the stairs because they would have thought I was crazy. But I know the truth. I know what I felt on that first night, the terror that made me flee into the rain. And even now, years later, when I hear the sound of rain against a window or a door tap unexpectedly, I feel the same dread, the same certainty that something unseen is watching, waiting. The house is gone from my life, but the memory of the presence that could slip in unseen, lingers in my mind like the never-ending patter of rain on a stormy night. I often drive past the neighborhood, careful to keep my distance, and sometimes I swear I see a shadow moving behind the windows of that old house. It doesn't matter the time of day or the weather, it's always there, silent, patient, watching. I tell myself it's my imagination, but deep down I know better. Some nights I dream of it. Not a nightmare with monsters or gore, but something worse, a presence that waits, always at the edge of perception, never fully seen, but undeniably there. It whispers, just like that first night, calling my name softly, promising it's still here, still watching, and still patient. I have moved cities now, hundreds of miles away, but the sound of rain on the windows still makes my skin crawl. I have to check doors twice, locks thrice. Every shadow becomes a potential threat. Friends tell me it's paranoia, that I am letting fear control me. Maybe they're right. Maybe it was all in my mind. But I know the cold, heavy sensation of a presence in my house, the whisper in the dark, and the deliberate tapping that started it all. And I know that somewhere out there it waits for the next rainy night, the next person alone in the dark, to remind them it doesn't need doors to enter. The storm comes, and I am awake, listening. I will never be alone again, not really, because I know what it feels like to be watched, to be hunted, to have your own home turn against you without warning. And I know that no matter how far I go, the memory will never let me forget the sound of the first knock, the first whisper, and the first time I ran from the rain into someone else's house, knowing I was being followed even when no one could see it. I can still hear it sometimes, faintly in the distance, when the rain falls heavy. It's always just on the edge of hearing, like the faint tap of knuckles on wood, a whisper I cannot quite make out, but I feel it in my chest, the same slow, deliberate dread that I felt that first night. I know it's patient, I know it's watching, and I know that someday, if I'm not careful, it might follow me beyond memory, beyond fear, and into a place where even daylight cannot reach. Story the end.